The sound of bells was not a call to prayer, but a blade severing sleep, a cold, sharp intrusion into the perpetual twilight of the dormitory. In the year 1247, within the imposing stone walls of Whitby Abbey, a child of 7 stirred on a straw pallet, her breath forming ghostly clouds in air so cold it felt solid. This was not a school, nor a sanctuary, but a gilded cage, its bars forged from political machinations and religious fervor. Daughters of the nobility, some as young as 5, were deposited here like unwanted furniture, their childhoods bartered for their fathers' alliances with the powerful church. There was no laughter here, no warmth, no comfort, only the stark reality that from the moment the heavy oak doors closed behind them, their former lives were extinguished. They would never again feel a mother's embrace or taste a honey cake. Their world had shrunk to the cold stone of the abbey, where survival was taught as the highest form of devotion. Around her, 20 other girls moved with a spectral silence, their faces pale as candle wax in the gloom. Their small hands trembled as they pulled rough woolen habits over their heads, the coarse fabric a constant scratch against skin that had once known only the softness of silk. One child, no older than 5, fumbled helplessly with her robes. The instinct to help her was a physical ache, but the memory of Margaret was a fresh wound in the community's mind. Just last week, Margaret had dared to whisper comfort to a crying child. Her punishment was 3 days without food, and 3 days kneeling on dried peas scattered across the chapel floor until her knees bled through her stockings. The lesson was seared into every young soul. Compassion was a weakness, and kindness was a sin that would be scourged from them. Dawn at 4 a.m. brought no light of hope, only the grim commencement of obligation. At Shaftesbury Abbey, founded in 888 AD, the scene was identical. Girls from the most powerful families in England stumbled from their pallets, their bodies stiff from sleeping on floors that never knew warmth, in rooms where rats scurried between the stones. They were political currency, their value measured not in love, but in the dowries paid to be rid of them. Consider the story of Lady Giva, of Mercia's youngest daughter Edith, sent to the abbey in 1043 when she was barely 4 years old. The abbey's chronicle, written by Abbess Elfgu in careful Latin, contains a chillingly brief entry. Parvula Edith, little Edith, weeps without cease for 3 days and nights. Her tears freeze upon her cheeks in the morning cold. She calls for her mother in the Saxon tongue, but we speak only Latin here. She must learn that her mother is dead to her now, and God is her only father. This was the first and most brutal lesson, the severance of all earthly ties. The transformation of their identities was immediate and total. Their hair, once carefully braided and adorned by loving servants, was roughly shorn to the scalp to prevent the sin of vanity. Their delicate silk gowns were taken, replaced by scratchy wool that chafed their tender skin into a permanent, raw redness. Their soft hands, once protected by fine gloves, were now cracked and bleeding from the cold and the unaccustomed labour. Lady Matilda Fitzwalter, sent to Godstow Abbey near Oxford in 1185 at the age of 6, captured this profound loss of self in a letter later smuggled to her sister. "I remember the taste of marchpane and the feel of ermine against my cheek," she wrote. "Now I know only the taste of barley gruel and the feel of rough hemp against my skin. Sometimes I wonder if those early memories are dreams, for this stone world feels too real to have been preceded by any other life." In this new existence, silence was not golden. It was the essential currency of survival. From the first morning prayer until the final bell at night, speaking was forbidden unless it was a recited lesson or a confession of sin. The children learned a new, subterranean language, a lexicon of glances, subtle hand placements during prayer, and carefully coded postures in the refectory. A tilted head could signal desperate hunger. A certain way of holding a prayer book might indicate illness. A particular slump of the shoulders during Mass could be a silent scream of despair. This enforced quiet was broken only by the sounds the children learned to dread most: the scuff of a disciplinarian's sandal and the sharp hiss of a leather strap cutting through the air. At Barking Abbey in Essex, renowned for its harsh discipline, the punishment chamber was a small, windowless stone room. Here, girls were taken for infractions as minor as smiling during prayers or moving too slowly in a procession. Sister Manard, the disciplinarian from 1203 to 1219, kept a meticulous record in her Libra Correctionis, a ledger that reads like a catalogue of institutionalized cruelty. Her entries were stark and unemotional. Alicia, age 7, struck 5 times with the rod for laughing during none. Marguerite, age 9, 15 strokes for speaking during the reading of scripture. Beatrix, age 5, held by the arms while struck 10 times for wetting her bedding. These were not rare events but daily rituals, ensuring the children lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror, flinching at sudden movements, their eyes perpetually downcast, their spirits already learning the contours of the cage that would hold them for a decade or more. If silence was the first lesson, the systematic breaking of the body was the second. A brutal curriculum taught through hunger, cold, and relentless fatigue. The abbeys and priories of medieval England were not just spiritual prisons but physical fortresses, where a child's own flesh became their enemy, a source of pain to be conquered in the name of holiness. The meager rations of gritty black bread and thin barley gruel were not a result of poverty but of design. Hunger was intentional, a spiritual discipline meant to subdue the will and crush any lingering attachment to worldly comforts. At Wilton Abbey, breakfast was a single small piece of bread and a cup of water. The main meal, dinner, was a bland porridge that offered little nourishment. Children who arrived from noble homes, plump and rosy-cheeked, were soon transformed into gaunt figures with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed too large for their pale faces. Their growing bodies, desperate for sustenance, became obsessed with food. They would hoard crusts in the folds of their habits, dream not of salvation but of roasted fowl and honeyed wine, their prayers interrupted by the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Agnes of Bohemia, daughter of a king, was sent to a convent in Prague at age 8. Her own confessor, Brother Francis, wrote a concerned letter to her father stating, "Your daughter speaks of nothing but food. She counts the hours between meals. She weeps not for your absence, but for the memory of roasted fowl and honeyed wine. This is not devotion, Your Majesty. This is desperation." The cold was an even more relentless tormentor. Heating was a rare luxury, typically limited to a single small fire in the chapter house where the nuns gathered. The dormitories where the children slept remained unheated, even as snow piled against the narrow windows and ice crusted the water basins overnight. They slept fully clothed, huddling 3 or 4 to a narrow straw mattress, their thin woolen blankets providing scant protection against the penetrating chill. At Numinster Abbey in Winchester, the dormitory was a long, narrow hall with no windows and a single, inadequate fireplace at one end. The cold was so pervasive that it became a character in their lives, a silent, biting presence that never left. Lady Isabel de Clare, sent to Amesbury Abbey at age 6, would later write in her adult memoir of the auditory horror of those nights. "I remember the sound of teeth chattering in the darkness, like castanets played by invisible hands," she recalled. Her memory then turned to a tragedy that was as common as it was unremarked upon. "I remember the girl next to me, Marie, who was barely 5 and came from Normandy. She spoke no English and wept every night for her nurse. One morning in February, she would not wake. Her lips were blue as violets. They carried her away while we recited morning prayers, and we never spoke of her again. It was as if she had never existed." Death was a frequent and unremarkable visitor in these stone corridors. Children succumbed to fever, consumption, wasting sickness, or simply the profound despair that modern medicine would call a failure to thrive. The Abbey records noted these passings with a chilling, matter-of-fact brevity. The death roll for Shaftesbury Abbey in 1209 listed, Johanna, age 5, died of fever on the feast of St. Michael. Marguerite, age 7, died of wasting sickness on the feast of St. Luke. Beatrice, age 6, died of consumption on the feast of St. Martin. There were no surnames, no notifications to grieving families, no elaborate funerals. These children, who had been born into nobility and privilege, were buried in unmarked graves in the convent cemetery, their lives reduced to a single line in an account book, their identities erased twice over. The assault on the body was compounded by a deliberate and chronic deprivation of sleep, a torture method that breaks the spirit as effectively as any whip. The night was regularly shattered by the ringing of bells calling them to prayer. They were dragged from their pallets at midnight for matins, again at 3 a.m. for lauds, and then once more at dawn for prime. Their developing bodies, already weakened by poor nutrition and constant cold, were pushed beyond their limits. At Godstow Abbey, the children became so sleep-deprived they developed a strange somnambulant state known as the walking sleep. They would rise and recite prayers while barely conscious, their eyes open but unseeing, their voices joining in unison chants they had memorized through sheer, mind-numbing repetition rather than understanding. Lady Alice Fitzhugh, who spent 12 years at Godstow, described this psychological fragmentation in a letter to her niece. "I learned to pray in my sleep," she confessed, "to genuflect while dreaming, to sing psalms while my mind wandered through memories of sunlight and laughter. We were like clockwork dolls, wound up each morning and set in motion by the bells. I feared that if the bells ever stopped, I would collapse entirely, for I had forgotten how to move without their command. In this world, even rest was not a sanctuary, and the body was taught that its most basic needs were enemies of the soul. Beyond the physical torment of hunger, cold, and the rod lay a more insidious form of cruelty, the systematic dismantling of a child's emotional world. The abbey's regime understood that to truly conquer a soul, one must first sever its connections to love, memory, and identity. Emotional bonds were not merely discouraged, they were treated as a sin rivaling heresy, a dangerous idolatry that threatened the absolute authority of the institution. At St. Mary's Abbey in Bedfordshire, girls were expressly forbidden from forming particular friendships. They were regularly moved between dormitories to prevent any attachments from taking root, their lives a constant state of upheaval that ensured profound loneliness, even in a crowd. Letters from home, those precious lifelines to a past life, were not private comforts but public spectacles, read aloud to the entire community to strip them of their personal solace and to humiliate the recipient. Gifts from families were confiscated and distributed equally, a practice that systematically removed any sense of individual care or special love, teaching the children that they were interchangeable units, not unique beings worthy of specific affection. Dame Clemence of Barking, who ruled her abbey with an iron will from 1173 to 1186, instituted a brutal policy of spiritual detachment. "The past is death," she proclaimed to her charges. "Only the present service to God matters. Those who dwell on earthly affections will find no peace in prayer." Children who dared to mention their parents or siblings were punished with solitary confinement in lightless stone cells, fed only bread and water until they verbally renounced their worldly attachments. The goal was to create a vacuum where familial love had once been, a hollow space to be filled only with fear and duty. The psychological toll of this enforced amnesia was devastating. Young Lady Moira de Browser, sent to a Herefordshire priory at age 7, confessed her struggle in a secret diary, a dangerous act of defiance in itself. "I try to remember my mother's face, but it grows dimmer each day," she wrote. "Sister Agatha says this is good, that I am learning to love God more than earthly things. But I do not feel love for God. I feel only emptiness, as if something precious has been carved out of my chest with a dull knife. I pretend to be holy, but inside I am becoming hollow." This psychological warfare extended into the shadows of the night, into realms of abuse that were never officially acknowledged, but were whispered about in confessionals and hinted at in terrified letters. At Warewell Abbey in Hampshire, Father Edmund the Confessor wrote a troubled letter to his bishop in 1278, stating, "I am troubled by what I hear in the confessional. Young girls speak of inappropriate touching by elder nuns, of being made to lie with sisters for warmth in ways that disturb their innocence. I know not how to counsel them, for they fear punishment if they resist. Yet their souls are surely being damaged by these practices. These unholy things in the darkness, as described by Lady Isabel de Fortibus, were the ultimate violation, using the guise of piety or necessity to inflict deep-seated trauma. When Isabel managed to send a coded message to her father, the Earl of Devon, describing evil touches, he immediately withdrew her from Canonsley Abbey, writing furiously to King Edward I, "I have seen the marks on her body, the fear in her eyes. I will not leave her in that place of corruption." Yet for every child rescued, countless others suffered in silence, their voices stifled by threats and the overwhelming power of the institution. The methods used were a masterclass in psychological control, creating what modern experts would recognize as learned helplessness. Children were isolated from everything familiar, subjected to constant surveillance, punished for showing emotion, and rewarded only for displays of complete submission. The rule at Nunton Priory explicitly stated, "The young maid must be watched always, for in solitude she may remember her former life and grow sorrowful. When she weeps, she must be corrected. When she smiles, she must be questioned. When she speaks of home, she must be punished. Only when she shows neither joy nor sorrow, but perfect indifference to all earthly things, has she achieved the proper state of grace." The aim was to create a human void. The novice mistress at Barking Abbey, Dame Euphemia, wrote with chilling satisfaction about the transformation of a once vibrant girl. Young Lady Philippa arrived last spring full of worldly pride and stubborn will. She spoke often of her silk gowns and her pet falcon. Today she knelt before me and begged forgiveness for her former vanity. God has conquered her rebellious heart. This was not a spiritual awakening. It was the systematic destruction of a personality, a process where a child was taught that her own thoughts were dangerous, her emotions were sinful, and her body was a source of shame. Within the convent walls, education was not a path to enlightenment but a tool for confinement, a curriculum meticulously designed to build a prison for the mind. The intellectual world offered to these children was deliberately narrow, limited to basic literacy in Latin sufficient for reciting prayers, the memorization of psalms, and the mastery of needlework for ecclesiastical vestments. At Lacock Abbey, founded in 1232, the curriculum was typical, focusing solely on scripture, embroidery, and the lives of female saints. Its foundress, Lady Ella of Salisbury, decreed in her charter, "Let the young maids learn submission through scripture, patience through needlework, and humility through the study of those holy women who suffered for Christ." There was no arithmetic to manage estates, no history beyond the hagiographies of martyrs, no science that might lead to questioning God's creation. The purpose was clear: to train obedient servants, not to educate thinking individuals. Curiosity was a dangerous spark that could ignite the tinder of doubt, and thus it was systematically extinguished. As Dame Ella herself warned, too much learning breeds pride, and pride is the root of all sin. Better they remain ignorant of worldly knowledge and pure in their devotion, than clever in their speech and corrupt in their hearts. This deliberate miseducation served a dual purpose. It kept the children permanently dependent on their religious instructors, and ensured that, should they ever leave, they would be utterly unequipped for life outside the abbey's walls. Yet, their labor was essential to the institution's economy. They were not just students, they were a source of valuable unpaid work. At Wilton Abbey, girls as young as 6 were assigned to the scriptorium, where they spent countless hours in dim light, hunched over precious manuscripts, their eyes straining and their backs bending as they copied texts. The Abbey's account books reveal that the sale of these manuscripts, produced by child labor, generated substantial income. Lady Constance of Brittany, who spent 7 years at Wilton, wrote with bitter clarity, "My hands are permanently stained with ink from countless hours of copying. My back is bent from hunching over manuscripts. My eyes are strained from seeing in dim light. We are not students here. We are laborers disguised as novices." Similarly, in the kitchens, children faced dangerous conditions, working with boiling water and sharp knives, their burns and cuts treated as lessons in patience rather than injuries requiring compassion. The most tragic and self-perpetuating consequence of this system was the cycle of abuse. The girls who endured this brutal training were the very women who would one day become the nuns and abbesses in charge of the next generation. Having known no other model of child-rearing, they replicated the only methods they understood. Dame Margaret of Anjou, who became abbess of Amesbury Abbey in 1315 after spending her own childhood within its walls, wrote frankly to a fellow abbess, "I know no other way to train children than as I was trained. The rod and the harsh word were my teachers, and they shall be teachers to the children in my care. I sometimes wonder if there might be gentler methods, but I fear that kindness breeds weakness and weakness breeds sin." This cyclical nature of cruelty ensured that the same harsh disciplines, the same psychological controls, and the same justifications for suffering were passed down from one generation to the next, a deadly inheritance that lasted for centuries. The economic underpinning of this entire arrangement was starkly transactional and could not be ignored. Noble families paid substantial dowries to the convents, often larger sums than would be required for a marriage arrangement. The convents thus became wealthy, powerful institutions, accumulating land, gold, and political influence through what was, in essence, the abandonment of children. The account books from Shaftesbury Abbey show that in 1267 alone, the abbey collected over 2,000 marks in dowries for accepting noble daughters, a sum equivalent to millions today. Dame Juliana of Norwich, who served as abbess of Carrow Abbey, wrote with unsettling honesty about this exchange. "The noble families pay handsomely to be rid of their surplus daughters. We provide them with a holy justification for what is essentially abandonment. The children suffer, but the coffers are full, and the church grows stronger." I sometimes wonder if God approves of this exchange of innocence for gold. This financial reality created a powerful incentive to maintain the system, ensuring a steady influx of both human capital to be disciplined and economic capital to be spent. Even in the heart of the oppressive silence, the human spirit flickered with a stubborn, defiant light. The children, in their profound isolation, found clandestine ways to assert their identities and preserve the memories of the lives they had lost. These acts of secret rebellion were small, desperate, and profoundly moving. During archaeological excavations at Shaftesbury Abbey in the 1960 seconds, a poignant cache of objects was discovered hidden within a dormitory wall, a silent testament to this resistance. There was a crudely carved wooden doll, a shard of colored glass cherished for its beauty, a carefully pressed flower, and, most heartbreakingly, a letter written in a childish hand on a scrap of parchment. The letter, in Norman French, was a message in a bottle, cast into the future. My name is Eleanor. I am 7 years old. I have been here for 2 years. I remember my mother's voice when she sang to me. I remember my father's beard against my cheek. I remember my dog, Ruzo, who would sleep at the foot of my bed. I write this so that someone will know I was here, that I was real, that I was loved. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts, like those drawn by a girl named Adelheid at Shaftesbury Abbey in 1267, tiny, crude figures of weeping children were discovered centuries later, secret marginalia that gave silent voice to a pain that could never be spoken aloud. For some, the resistance was not silent but vocal, leading to brutal confrontations that revealed the system's absolute intolerance for a questioning spirit. At Godstow Abbey, a girl named Johanna of Winchester became infamous for her refusal to stop asking about her family. For 3 years, she endured increasingly severe punishments for her defiance. She was eventually confined to a cell so small she could not stand upright, fed a minimal diet of bread and water, and subjected to daily interrogations. The Abbey's disciplinary records preserve her courageous, heartbreaking questions. "I asked again if God truly wants children to suffer," she told her interrogators. "I asked why prayer feels like poison in my mouth. I asked why I dream of my mother's face if I am supposed to forget her. These questions come from my heart, not from the devil. Why is my heart so evil?" After 6 months of solitary confinement, the questions stopped. Johanna emerged broken, her spirit finally crushed. The Abbey chronicler noted with satisfaction, "Johanna has finally achieved the proper state of submission. God has conquered her rebellious spirit." But this was not a victory of faith. It was the annihilation of a soul. This systematic destruction had a lasting impact, creating adults who were ghosts of their former selves. When the dissolution of the monasteries under King Henry VIII in the 1530s finally threw open the abbey gates, freedom came as a different kind of shock. Women who had been institutionalized since early childhood found the outside world terrifying and incomprehensible. They possessed no practical skills for secular life, struggled to form normal relationships, and were haunted by deep-seated trauma. Lady Margaret Pole, who had been imprisoned at Sion Abbey as a child, expressed this profound dislocation after her release. "They have opened the cage," she wrote, "but the bird has forgotten how to fly. I stand in sunlight and feel only fear. I hear laughter and do not understand its meaning. I am free, but I am not alive. They killed the child I was so thoroughly that no woman could grow from her remains." The stories of these forgotten children are a stark warning from the past, a reminder that institutional abuse is not a modern invention. The justifications used by medieval abbesses that suffering is purifying, that obedience is paramount, that a broken will is a saved soul, echo through history in the words of every authority that has ever claimed cruelty serves a noble end. The bells that once called them to prayer have long since fallen silent. The stone walls have crumbled. The abbesses who tormented them have returned to dust. But the echo of their suffering remains. It is a warning that childhood is sacred, that innocence deserves protection, and that any system that systematically destroys the young in the name of salvation is itself damned. Remember them. Remember their names when you can find them. Remember their pain. Remember that they were children first, victims second, and statistics never. In remembering, we honor not just their suffering, but their enduring humanity. And in doing so, we guard against the return of any system that would sacrifice children on the altar of any cause, however noble it claims to be. Thank you for joining me on this heartbreaking journey into the past. If these forgotten stories of childhood and survival have moved you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of history's hidden truths. Let me know in the comments what part of this story resonated most deeply with you. It is incredible that we can connect across time and space, remembering these children together.